In the late 1950s, the world felt as though it were balancing on a tightrope stretched high above the unknown. The Cold War was not merely a geopolitical standoff, it was a constant psychological pressure. Every nation aligned with either the United States or the Soviet Union lived under the silent expectation that global conflict could erupt at any moment. It was a time defined by suspicion, secrecy, and the relentless race to outsmart the other side. Diplomatic tension flowed beneath seemingly routine events, and armies of scientists worked behind closed doors, each trying to develop technologies that would provide their nation with a competitive edge. It was in this charged environment that the earliest seeds of the internet were planted, long before the word internet even existed. The pivotal moment, often cited as the spark that set everything into motion, came in 1957, when the Soviet Union launched Sputnik 1 into orbit. It was the first artificial satellite in human history. To ordinary people, it was a small sphere with 4 long antennae that circled the Earth and beeped faintly through radio transmissions. But to the United States government, it was a warning shot. The satellite represented not just technology, but capability, proof that the Soviet Union had mastered rocketry in ways that suggested they might soon launch more than just satellites. They could launch weapons. They could breach American airspace. They could reshape the balance of power. Suddenly, the country that had prided itself on being the global leader in science and technology realized it had fallen behind. In response, the US government accelerated its investment in advanced research. New branches, agencies, and departments were formed to increase scientific output and coordinate innovation. Among the most important of these was the Advanced Research Projects Agency, known as ARPA. It would later become DARPA, but at this time, ARPA was focused on one mission: to ensure that the United States would never again be technologically blindsided. ARPA mandate was unusual for a military-oriented agency. Instead of focusing on immediate defense applications, it funded forward-looking research, high-risk projects that might take years to develop but had the potential to rewrite the future. It recruited civilian scientists, university researchers, and industry experts, creating a network of innovation that crossed boundaries between government, academia, and private enterprise. Across these environments, a question slowly took shape. How could the nation protect its military communications in the event of an attack, especially one that might destroy or disable conventional communication systems? At the time, communication relied heavily on centralized structures. If a key hub was destroyed, the entire network could collapse. Messages could be disrupted, commands could fail, and chaos could spread. This vulnerability was unacceptable in the nuclear age. Military strategists began pushing for a new kind of system, one that could withstand attack, one that was decentralized, resilient, and distributed. The concept was both simple and revolutionary. Instead of routing information through a single central point, communication could be spread across a network of interconnected nodes. If one node was destroyed, the others could continue passing messages. The network would be flexible, redundant, and almost impossible to shut down completely. This idea would eventually become one of the fundamental principles of the internet, but at the time, it was just a theoretical solution to a grim military scenario. The problem now was making it real. Researchers began exploring how to move digital information efficiently across a decentralized network. Computers were massive machines then, often rooms full of equipment, operated by technicians who understood their quirks intimately. Communication between computers was limited or non-existent. Most machines were isolated, and sharing data meant printing it, punching it into cards, or transferring tapes physically from one place to another. There was no universal language for computers to talk to each other, much less a standardized method for transferring information instantly. Into this landscape stepped a handful of visionary thinkers who saw beyond the limitations of their era. One of them was Paul Barron, a researcher at Rand Corporation, who proposed a radical model for distributing information through a fragmented, resilient network. He imagined breaking messages into smaller pieces that could travel independently across various paths before being reassembled at their destination. He called this packet switching. The idea was ahead of its time. Traditional telecommunications relied on circuit switching, dedicated lines between endpoints that carried data in a continuous stream. Packet switching broke that model, allowing information to move more freely and efficiently. It meant that no single route needed to remain open. Data could flow like water through many channels. Although Barron's ideas were initially met with skepticism from certain corners of the telecommunications industry, they resonated with military planners and forward-thinking scientists within ARPA. At the same time, across the Atlantic, similar ideas were being developed independently by Donald Davies at the National Physical Laboratory in the United Kingdom. The convergence of these concepts would shape the future of digital communication globally. As ARPA explored ways to develop a decentralized communication system, it also recognized the importance of connecting its researchers across different universities and laboratories. In the 1960s, computing resources were scarce and expensive. A single university might have only one powerful machine, and researchers elsewhere might never have access to it. ARPA saw an opportunity. What if computers at different institutions could share information and computing power? What if researchers could work collaboratively, not separated by distance or equipment constraints? It was an ambitious vision that blended military necessity with academic exploration. The initial steps toward this interconnected system were small but meaningful. ARPA funded a series of computer science projects that pushed the boundaries of what machines could do. Among the institutions involved were MIT, UCLA, the University of California at Santa Barbara, and the University of Utah, each working on aspects of computing that would later tie into a broader network. ARPA encouraged experimentation, granting researchers freedom to try unconventional approaches. This culture of innovation created an environment where breakthroughs could emerge naturally. By the mid-1960s, discussions began to crystallize around creating a unified network that would link ARPA-funded computers. The idea slowly transformed from a conceptual framework into a concrete project. ARPA hired Lawrence Roberts, a talented researcher known for his work in computer networking, to lead the effort. Roberts had been inspired by experimental computer links and was determined to build something far more advanced, working under the guidance of ARPA influential director JCR. Licklider, a man who believed deeply in the future of interactive computing, Roberts began mapping out what would become ARPANET. At this stage, the network was envisioned not as a public utility, but as a specialized research tool. Its primary purpose was to link together scientists who were geographically scattered, yet working towards similar goals. But beneath this academic collaboration lay a deeper objective: developing communication technologies that could withstand disruptions. The network had to be flexible, robust, and capable of routing information around any obstacles it encountered. The challenge then shifted to implementation. Packet switching, though promising, was still untested on a large scale. To build ARPANET, a new device was needed, something that could manage the flow of data between computers, breaking messages into packets and reassembling them at the other end. These became the interface message processors, or IMPs. They were the precursors to modern routers, and their creation marked a critical milestone in the development of networked communication. The task of constructing the IMPs was given to Bolt, Beranek, and Newman, a small but highly respected research company. Their engineers worked tirelessly to create machines that could handle communication in ways no device had before. They had to be reliable, efficient, and capable of routing packets dynamically. At the time, developing hardware and software simultaneously was a considerable challenge. especially for a concept so new. Yet within a few years, the pieces began to come together. By 1969, the first nodes of ARPANET were ready. UCLA, Stanford Research Institute, UC Santa Barbara, and the University of Utah became the inaugural participants. Each institution installed an IMP and connected it to its main computer. The moment the first message was transmitted from one node to another, the world changed in a way that almost no one at the time fully recognized. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't broadcast on television, but it was historic. This was the first time in human history that distant computers communicated through a shared digital network. The message was simple, a few letters transmitted before a system crash, but it proved the concept worked. The Internet's origin story had begun not with fanfare, but with quiet, careful experimentation in university labs, fueled by the urgent concerns of the Cold War and the imaginative thinking of scientists who dared to envision a different future. Yet this was only the beginning. ARPANET was small, experimental, and far from the vast interconnected world we know today. But in the late 1960s, a foundation had been laid, one that would soon expand, evolve, and eventually escape the confines of government research. What started as a Cold War safeguard was about to become something far greater, a network that would reshape communication, culture, business, and everyday life. And so, the story continues, chapter by chapter, as ARPANET grows, as new protocols emerge, as personal computers rise, and as the Internet transforms from a military experiment into a global necessity that billions rely on every day. By the time the 1960s came to a close, a remarkable transformation had taken place in the world of computing. What had once been isolated machines, massive, humming giants confined within individual laboratories, were now poised to become part of a shared digital ecosystem. The creation of ARPANET marked the beginning of an unprecedented shift, but it was only the first step. The real challenge and the true complexity lay in turning a handful of connected computers into a functioning communication network that could reliably transfer information, adapt to failures, and serve as a platform for collaborative research. At the heart of this new network was the idea of packet switching. It was revolutionary, not only because it allowed information to be broken into smaller pieces and routed independently, but because it represented a different way of thinking about communication itself. Traditional telecommunication systems were rigid. They depended on dedicated circuits, which meant that once a connection was established between 2 points, it stayed open for the entire duration of the communication. This worked well for voice calls, but was incredibly inefficient for computers, which sent bursts of data rather than continuous streams. Packet switching allowed networks to be shared efficiently, maximizing bandwidth and enabling dynamic routing. But while the theory was in place, the practical task of bringing packet switching to life was daunting. The engineers and researchers working on ARPANET had to transform abstract diagrams and theoretical protocols into hardware and software that could function in the real world, with all its unexpected variables and tensions. This meant building devices that had never been built before, writing code that had never been written before, and testing a system that had no blueprint to follow. The interface message processors, or IMPs, were the physical backbone of ARPANET's early structure. These refrigerator-sized machines were responsible for handling the movement of packets between nodes. The company tasked with creating them, Bolt, Beranek, and Newman BBN, was known for its cutting-edge research in acoustics, computing, and communications. But even for BBN, the ARPANET project was something entirely new. The engineers were working under tight timelines and with enormous expectations. They were building not just a device, but a new kind of infrastructure. In the months leading up to the installation of the first IMPs, BBN's engineers raced through design challenges. They had to create robust systems capable of error detection, packet routing, and communication across incompatible computer architectures. Each university connected to the network used its own unique hardware and operating systems. There were no standard protocols, no universal languages. Building a network meant creating compatibility where none existed. Despite these difficulties, progress moved steadily. When the first IMP arrived at UCLA in September 1969, it marked a turning point. The machine, accompanied by a BBN engineer, was hauled into the university's computing facility, unpacked, connected, and tested. Its installation was met with excitement among the researchers, who understood that they were witnessing something groundbreaking, even if its full implications were still hidden beyond the horizon. The second node soon followed at Stanford Research Institute. With 2 IMPs online, the world's first network connection could be attempted. On October 29, 1969, UCLA researcher Charlie Klein prepared to send a simple message to Sri. He attempted to type in login, but computers in that era were not always cooperative. After typing the L and the O, the system crashed. The first message ever sent over what would eventually become the Internet was not a grand phrase or symbolic declaration. It was simply low. But those 2 letters represented a monumental achievement. They were the first digital footsteps on a path that would soon span the entire globe. With the first 2 nodes operational, the network expanded rapidly. By the end of 1969, 4 universities were connected. In the succeeding years, dozens more joined. Each new node brought unique challenges. Some institutions used systems with little documentation, requiring engineers to spend hours troubleshooting compatibility issues. Others had researchers eager to push the network's limits, testing new protocols and applications that stretched the capabilities of the nascent system. The diversity of the early network environment became one of ARPANET's greatest strengths. It forced creative problem-solving and encouraged the development of universal standards that would later underpin the global Internet. As ARPANET grew, so did its cultural significance within the computing communities of the time. For the researchers who gained access, it opened doors to collaboration that had previously been impossible. Scientists could share data instantly, send messages across the country in seconds, and access computing resources located hundreds or thousands of miles away. What had once been an isolating process, waiting for mailed tapes, copying printouts by hand, or conducting research alone late into the night, was transformed into a shared intellectual experience. The system also began to foster new kinds of applications. One of the earliest and most transformative was email. Invented by Ray Tomlinson in the early 1970s, email quickly became the most popular use of ARPANET. Tomlinson created a system that allowed users to send messages between computers, marking the first time electronic communication had been achieved on a network scale. The now famous use of the symbol to identify email addresses originated from his early experiments. Email became an instant success because it solved a very real problem. Researchers needed a quick and convenient way to communicate. Unlike phone calls, email didn't require synchronizing schedules. Unlike physical mail, it was instantaneous. Its popularity skyrocketed, and soon most network traffic consisted of email messages rather than scientific data transfers. As ARPANET continued to develop, it began to move beyond its initial military and research focus. New ideas emerged from the vibrant culture of experimentation that surrounded it. Graduate students, often working late into the night, developed software tools, protocols, and networking experiments. Some of these projects were playful or personal, while others laid essential groundwork for the systems that would eventually become core components of the Internet. However, ARPANET was still contained within a specific world, a world of government research institutions, universities, and laboratories. While it demonstrated the potential of networked computing, it remained limited by its administrative structure. Access was restricted, and the technology was still too expensive and specialized to reach the broader public. But beneath the surface, forces were gathering that would push the network far beyond its original boundaries. One such force came from the emergence of increasingly powerful, increasingly affordable computers. The mainframes of the 1950s and 1960s were impressive feats of engineering, but they were cumbersome and accessible only to institutions with deep pockets. In the 1970s, the development of minicomputers and the first personal computers began changing the landscape. Machines became smaller, more versatile, and less expensive. As computing spread to more environments, the need for better network connectivity grew alongside it. Another driving force was the realization that ARPANET was only one of several networks being developed around the world. In Europe, universities were building their own packet-switched networks. In the United Kingdom, the National Physical Laboratory had its own system. In France, the Cyclades Research Network explored advanced ideas about communication protocols. Even within the United States, other networks emerged for different purposes, each with its own architecture and rules. This diversity created a challenge. If networks could not communicate with each other, the world risked creating isolated digital islands instead of a unified global system. Solving this problem required a new level of innovation, one that would produce the protocols that form the Internet's foundation to this day. But this work would come a little later. For now, ARPANET was proving that networking was not only possible, but transformative. It was turning distant researchers into close collaborators, turning isolated machines into shared resources, and turning theoretical ideas into practical working systems. The early 1970s saw a steady strengthening of ARPANET's capabilities and its community. Conferences were held where researchers exchanged ideas, presented experiments, and debated the future of networking. Discussions often went beyond technical matters, touching on philosophy, communication theory, and the social impact of connected computing. Many recognized that this new technology had the potential to reshape society, though few could predict exactly how. Within government circles, ARPANET was hailed as a technological triumph. It demonstrated not only innovation, but resilience. The network's distributed structure allowed it to survive failures within individual nodes. Tests were conducted to measure how the system performed under strain, and results consistently showed that packet switching was robust, efficient, and adaptable. The success of ARPANET validated the concept of decentralized communication and encouraged further research and investment. And yet, this period was only the dawn of the networking revolution. The pieces were beginning to fall into place, but many of the most essential components, the unifying protocols, the global structures, the personal computing boom, the eventual birth of the World Wide Web, still lay ahead. The early network was a remarkable achievement, but it remained a prototype, a glimpse of what could be. For the visionaries working on it, however, the path forward was already beginning to emerge. They understood that the idea of connecting machines was not the end goal, but the beginning. The real power of a network lay not in the cables or the hardware, but in what people could do with it. Collaboration, communication, creativity, all these possibilities expanded as the network grew. ARPANET was no longer simply a Cold War experiment. It had evolved into something much larger, a platform for innovation, a tool for research, and an early model for what would one day become a global necessity, touching every aspect of human life. The chapter of ARPANET's birth was closing, but the technological revolution it triggered was only just beginning. The world was on the cusp of a transformation that would extend far beyond the walls of universities and research labs, altering economies, societies, and the daily lives of billions. As the 1970s progressed, ARPANET's success raised both new possibilities and new problems. The network had proven it could connect distant computers, handle data reliably, and support innovative applications like email. But as more universities and laboratories joined, it became clear that the existing system, though groundbreaking, was not enough. The world was beginning to build multiple networks, each with its own rules, its own architecture, and its own approach to communication. If these networks remained isolated, the progress achieved through ARPANET would hit a natural ceiling. What the world needed next was a way to connect networks themselves. This need gave rise to one of the most transformative ideas in the history of technology: internetworking. Internetworking was simple to describe, but incredibly complex to achieve. The goal was to allow different networks, built with different hardware and using different communication methods, to work together as part of a larger whole. It meant packets should be able to travel across multiple linked systems, yet appear to the end user as if they were moving through a single unified network. This concept demanded a universal language, a protocol that could work anywhere. Two visionary thinkers, Vince Cerf and Bob Kahn, stepped into this challenge. Their work would ultimately shape the very foundation of the internet as we know it. Bob Kahn had been working with ARPA and became deeply familiar with the challenges posed by the growing number of independent networks. While ARPANET used packet switching, other networks used different methods. Without a common protocol, they could not communicate. The key innovation Kahn imagined was a layered system, one that abstracted away the specific details of each individual network and focused instead on ensuring that packets could move smoothly from one environment to another. Vince Cerf, a pioneering computer scientist who had been involved in ARPANET research, collaborated closely with Kahn. Together, they designed what would become the Transmission Control Protocol and the Internet Protocol, known collectively as TCP/IP. Their goal was not merely to improve ARPANET, but to create an entirely new architecture that could unite networks around the world. TCP/IP was based on a deceptively simple principle. Networks should be interconnected through a universal protocol, yet operate independently. That meant the protocol would not dictate how each network functioned internally. Instead, it would focus on how packets were addressed, routed, transmitted, and reassembled. It created a common ground that allowed vastly different systems to communicate. One of TCP/IP's key insights was that packets could be intentionally unreliable in transit, with the protocol itself ensuring reliability. In earlier systems, networks tried to guarantee that every link along the path was perfect. With TCP/IP, reliability shifted to the endpoints, the sender and receiver. If packets were lost, delayed, or duplicated, the endpoints would detect the issue and retransmit data as needed. This flexibility made the system incredibly resilient. By the mid-1970s, TCP/IP began to take shape through papers, experiments, and early implementations. It was not instantly adopted. Introducing a new protocol meant rewriting software, reconfiguring systems, and training a new generation of engineers. Many institutions were satisfied with their existing network setups, and some resisted the idea of changing everything to adopt a new architecture. But ARPA saw the need for a universal protocol clearly. The agency recognized that if it wanted a global, interconnected future, it needed to invest heavily in TCP/IP. Researchers within the agency pushed for adoption, ran simulations, and demonstrated the protocol's flexibility. In 1977, a dramatic test was conducted to prove the feasibility of internetworking. 3 networks were linked via TCP/IP, a mobile packet radio network, a satellite-based network, and the terrestrial ARPANET. Packets successfully moved across all 3, proving that the protocol could unify different network types. This experiment was a breakthrough. It showed that the internet, though it didn't yet have that name, could be built. Still, widespread adoption was gradual. Network administrators had to be convinced. Engineers had to rewrite systems. The process took years. But by the late 1970s, momentum had begun to shift decisively toward TCP/IP. The protocol was robust, flexible, and forward-looking. It solved problems that were becoming too big to ignore. The crucial moment came with a bold decision. ARPANET would formally switch to TCP/IP on January 1, 1983. This event is often referred to as the Flag Day of the Internet. On that day, every connected machine was required to transition to the new protocol. It was a coordinated global shift, a remarkable feat in an era without modern communication tools. People sent instructions by mail, by printed memos, by early emails, and by phone calls. Teams worked through the night to update systems. When January 1 arrived, the transition succeeded. ARPANET was now running entirely on TCP/IP. With this transition, the door to global networking had been flung open. Any network, using any technology, could join the growing community as long as it implemented the protocol. TCP/IP was the great equalizer, a universal language for digital communication. At the same time, other developments helped propel internetworking forward. The emergence of Ethernet, developed by Robert Metcalfe at Xerox PARC, created a fast and efficient way to connect local devices within offices and laboratories. Local area networks began to flourish, and these LANs could link to larger regional networks, which in turn could link to ARPANET. Everywhere, networks were multiplying, and with TCP/IP, they had a means to unite. The 1970s also saw the rise of Usenet, a distributed discussion system that allowed users to post messages to shared newsgroups. Though not part of ARPANET, it represented a growing desire for global communication. People were beginning to feel the pull of a connected world, even if they didn't yet know what that world would become. Internetworking also opened the door to expansion beyond government-funded research. While ARPA continued to support and shape development, new players began entering the field. Universities wanted more access. Businesses began to see the potential of networked communication. Private companies started experimenting with linking their internal systems. The world was slowly preparing for the next leap, one that would take the internet from research labs into the public domain. As the decade drew to a close, the outlines of the modern internet were becoming visible. TCP/IP provided the foundation. Networks were growing. People were beginning to share files, communicate electronically, and collaborate across distances with ease. But the network was still limited in scale and purpose. It had not yet escaped its research roots. What came next? The expansion into universities, the rise of personal computers, the commercialization of networking, and eventually the creation of the World Wide Web would transform the internet from a technical marvel into a global phenomenon. For now, though, the world had taken a crucial step. The invention of TCP/IP had solved one of the greatest engineering challenges of the century. It had unified networks, opened the door to global communication, and created the architecture that still supports the internet today. The work of Cerf and Kahn proved that the future of communication lay not in isolated systems, but in a network of networks, a connected world where information could move freely. Internetworking had been born. The era of the internet had begun, even if the world didn't yet realize it. By the early 1980s, ARPANET had already undergone significant transformations. It had begun as a military research project driven by Cold War fears, evolved into a proving ground for new networking technologies, and ultimately become the testbed for the revolutionary TCP/IP protocols that would one day connect the entire planet. But for ARPANET to truly become the backbone of something larger, something that would eventually touch governments, universities, corporations, and eventually everyday people, it needed to grow beyond its origins. It needed a broader community, a broader mission, and a broader sense of purpose. The next stage in the internet's evolution came through the academic world. Universities had already played a central role in ARPANET's development. They hosted the early nodes, conducted protocol testing, and provided the environment for countless innovations. But in the 1980s, the relationship between ARPANET and academia deepened profoundly. What had once been a network limited to a small number of institutions became the foundation for a growing collection of regional and national networks centered around research and education. This expansion was driven by several factors. First, computing was becoming more central to scientific research. Fields like physics, astronomy, chemistry, and engineering were generating vast amounts of data that required advanced computing power and fast communication. Researchers no longer wanted isolated machines. They needed access to remote supercomputers, specialized databases, and collaborative workspaces. ARPANET offered a solution, but its capacity was limited, and its military oversight created restrictions that increasingly clashed with academic freedom. Second, the rise of personal and departmental computing dramatically increased demand for networking. Departments were purchasing minicomputers and workstations that needed to communicate with one another. Students and faculty were eager to experiment with digital communication. The community that had once consisted of a few elite researchers was growing rapidly, and these new users wanted access to the same benefits that ARPANET provided. Third, a cultural shift was underway. Computing was no longer viewed as an isolated technical specialty. It was becoming a central component of education and research. Collaboration across universities was becoming the norm, not the exception. The academic world was ready for a network that matched its needs. The National Science Foundation, NSF, recognized this shift early. In the mid-1980s, as ARPANET's traffic increased and the academic community's needs expanded, NSF launched an ambitious plan to build its own network infrastructure capable of supporting education and research at a national scale. This new network would eventually become NSFNet, a pivotal step in the Internet's transformation. Before NSFNet, the NSF had funded the creation of a series of supercomputing centers across the United States, giving researchers access to powerful machines for complex calculations. But these supercomputers were only truly useful if users could access them from their home institutions. The NSF needed a network to connect them. ARPANET could not handle the demand, and its military restrictions made expansion difficult. It was clear that the academic community needed its own network. NSFNet was launched in 1986 as a backbone network designed to connect universities to supercomputing centers and to one another. It used TCP/IP, which ensured compatibility not only with ARPANET, but with any other network that adopted the protocol. This design decision was crucial. It meant NSFNet didn't compete with ARPANET, it expanded upon it. The two networks, along with regional academic networks that quickly emerged, formed a growing web of interconnected systems. This expanding network became known collectively as the Internet, a term that initially referred simply to the act of internetworking, but soon became synonymous with the global digital infrastructure itself. The early NSFNet backbone operated at 56 kilobits per second. By modern standards, this is astonishingly slow, far slower than even the weakest home internet connection today. But for the time, it was a powerful and meaningful advancement. It enabled researchers across the country to exchange data, access remote machines, and collaborate with colleagues they had never met in person. As demand increased, NSFNet upgraded to 1.5 megabits per second in 1988 and then to 45 megabits per second in 1991. These upgrades were transformative. They enabled not just scientific collaboration, but the creation of a national digital infrastructure that countless universities and regional networks could join. NSFNet became the dominant non-military backbone, gradually eclipsing ARPANET in size, importance, and influence. As the academic world embraced networked computing, a new culture began to form, a culture defined by open collaboration, curiosity, experimentation, and innovation. Researchers exchanged emails, files, ideas, and software. Students participated in early online forums, shared programs, and developed new tools. Faculty members used the network to collaborate on publications, share datasets, and coordinate international research projects. The network's openness encouraged creativity. People were building things simply because they could. At the same time, new academic networks formed to support specialized communities. BitNet, established in 1981, connected universities through a simpler email and file transfer system. The network's slogan, "Because it's time," captured the spirit of the moment. Europe launched EARN, Canada built Net North, and together with BitNet, these networks formed a global academic community that predated the World Wide Web. These networks were not directly part of ARPANET, but they increasingly adopted TCP/IP or built gateways that allowed them to interoperate with other systems. Meanwhile, ARPANET itself was changing. As more academic networks came online, ARPANET's military and civilian communities began to diverge. There was growing discomfort within the Department of Defense regarding the mixing of military, classified, and academic traffic on the same network. By the early 1980s, the military began separating its internal systems from the broader research network. This process culminated in 1983 when ARPANET officially split into two networks, ARPANET Civilian Research and MILNET Military Operations. Both continued to use TCP/IP, but they served different communities. This separation marked a symbolic turning point. The network that had begun as a Cold War project was now primarily a research tool. As NSFNet grew, ARPANET began to fade in significance. By 1990, ARPANET was officially decommissioned, having served its purpose. Its legacy continued through the protocols, technologies, and communities it helped create. Even though ARPANET shut down, the momentum it generated did not slow. NSFNet became the backbone of the Internet, and the academic world expanded the network's reach. Universities created campus networks that connected thousands of students and faculty. Regional networks linked entire states and regions. International collaborations flourished, connecting researchers across continents. The Internet was no longer a small, experimental system. It was becoming a global infrastructure. This period also saw the rise of early applications that paved the way for the web. Email was already popular, but new tools like FTP File Transfer Protocol, Telnet, Archie, an early file search system, and Gopher, a menu-based information browser, enabled users to access information across the network with unprecedented ease. Although these tools lacked the graphical interfaces and multimedia capabilities of the future web, they represented important evolutionary steps. They made information accessible, searchable, and shareable. They demonstrated that the Internet could be more than just a communication tool. It could become a vast information resource. In parallel, the idea of user communities began to flourish. Usenet newsgroups grew dramatically, becoming early hubs for online discussion. People debated science, shared jokes, posted fan theories, exchanged technical advice, and even engaged in heated arguments, all in an online environment that predated social media by decades. These early communities demonstrated the social potential of digital networks long before the general public had access to the Internet. Throughout the 1980s, the academic world played a crucial role in shaping the ethos of the emerging Internet. The culture of openness, sharing, and collaboration that defined university research influenced how the network developed. Protocols were publicly documented, software was shared freely, standards were created through discussion and consensus. The idea that the Internet should be open and interoperable became a core principle. This openness would later prove essential for its explosive growth. By the end of the decade, the pieces were in place for a transformation that no one fully anticipated. NSFNet had grown dramatically forming a national backbone that connected thousands of institutions. International networks had joined the broader ecosystem. Academic and scientific communities were thriving online. And perhaps most importantly, the protocols that supported the network were open and accessible, allowing anyone with the right equipment to build their own networks and connect. But one key ingredient was still missing: a way to make the internet easy to use. For all its power, networking remained technical, text-based, and often intimidating. The general public still had no access, no reason to join, and no awareness that a quiet revolution was happening behind the scenes. The internet was still confined to researchers, students, government agencies, and a small group of enthusiasts. That would soon change. A development was about to emerge from a European research lab, one that would transform the internet from a specialized tool into a global cultural and economic force. The invention of the World Wide Web was just around the corner, waiting to lift the internet out of obscurity and into the hands of billions. By the late 1980s, the internet had grown into a powerful but still obscure network, used mostly by researchers, students, military personnel, and enthusiasts. It was a tool of extraordinary potential, but for most people it remained invisible, hidden behind command lines, academic culture, and specialized terminology. The internet could transfer files, host discussion groups, and connect universities across the world, but it lacked something essential: ease of use. What it needed was a vision that could bridge the gap between raw connectivity and everyday human communication. That vision came from a quiet office at CERN, the European Organization for Nuclear Research, one of the largest physics laboratories in the world. There, a British computer scientist named Tim Berners-Lee was struggling with a simple problem that had far-reaching implications. CERN was home to thousands of researchers from dozens of countries. They produced vast amounts of data, documentation, and analysis, but the information was scattered across different computer systems, stored in different formats, and accessible only through complex procedures. If a scientist wanted to find a document, they needed to know which machine it was on, how to access it, and what format it was written in. The process was inefficient and often frustrating. Berners-Lee recognized that the core problem was not the data itself, but the lack of an organized, universal method of accessing it. In 1989, he proposed an idea that would change the world: a system that could link documents across different machines using simple, clickable connections. He imagined a network of information where users could navigate by following links, just as one might follow references in a research paper, but instantly and effortlessly. He called his idea the World Wide Web. Berners-Lee's proposal outlined three key components that would define the web. First, URLs, uniform resource locators, that would give every document, image, or resource on the web a unique address. Users would no longer need to know which machine a document lived on. They simply needed its address. Second, HTTP, the Hypertext Transfer Protocol, which would govern how information was requested and transmitted over the internet. HTTP allowed different machines to communicate in a standardized way, regardless of their underlying systems. Third, HTML, the Hypertext Markup Language, which allowed documents to contain links connecting them to other documents. HTML made digital pages interactive, letting users jump instantly from one resource to another. These three technologies formed the foundation of the web: addresses, a method of communication, and a language for creating linked documents. At first, Berners-Lee's idea received little attention. The internet community was accustomed to text-based tools like FTP, Gopher, and Telnet. Many believed these older systems were sufficient, but Berners-Lee persisted, building the first web browser, called World Wide Web, and the first web server, which went online in 1990. His browser allowed users to view documents, follow links, and even edit pages, though editing would later become a separate process as the web evolved. The first website in history described the World Wide Web project itself. It contained instructions on how to create web pages and explained the vision behind the system. Few people saw it at the time, but it was the spark that would ignite a global revolution. The web was powerful, but it still needed something more: visibility. In 1991, CERN opened the web to the world, allowing anyone with internet access to browse pages and run web servers. At first, adoption was slow. The early web lacked the colorful graphics and multimedia elements people now associate with it. Most pages were simple text, and few outside the scientific community understood its potential. But momentum began building as word spread among programmers and developers. In 1993, a breakthrough came from the National Center for Supercomputing Applications, NCSA, at the University of Illinois. A small team of researchers, including Mark Andreessen and Eric Bina, created Mosaic, a graphical web browser that supported images and offered a user-friendly interface. Unlike earlier browsers, Mosaic could run on ordinary personal computers and made the web accessible to non-experts. Mosaic's release marked a turning point. Suddenly, the web wasn't just for researchers, it was for everyone. Pages could contain pictures. The interface was intuitive. Users could point and click instead of typing commands. The web transformed from a technical curiosity into something ordinary people could use, understand, and enjoy. Universities embraced Mosaic enthusiastically. Students explored early websites, created their own pages, and introduced the web to friends and classmates. The browser quickly spread beyond academia into businesses, homes, and public institutions. It wasn't long before the power of the web became undeniable. The explosion of interest created a fertile environment for new companies and innovators. Mark Andreessen left NCSA and co-founded Netscape Communications in 1994. Netscape released Netscape Navigator, a faster and more polished browser that quickly dominated the early commercial web. Businesses began to see enormous opportunities. They set up websites, explored online communication, and experimented with digital commerce. The web had become a new frontier, open, decentralized, and full of possibility. Meanwhile, the number of websites grew rapidly. In 1993, there were just over 100 servers online. By 1994, there were thousands. By the end of the decade, there were millions. The web grew not through central planning, but through individual creativity. Anyone could publish a page, share information, or build a service. This openness set the web apart from every communication system that came before it. But while browsers and websites expanded, the underlying infrastructure needed to grow as well. NSFNet continued to serve as the backbone for many academic and public connections, but its capacity was strained. More people, more pages, and more data meant more demand. As commercial interest surged, policy debates emerged. Should the government continue running the backbone? Should commercial networks be allowed to connect freely? How could the internet remain open and stable while supporting rapid growth? In the early 1990s, the NSF decided to transition away from running the backbone itself, allowing private companies to take on more responsibility. The Commercial Internet Service Provider, ISP, was born. Companies began offering dial-up connections to the public, allowing anyone with a computer and a phone line to join the web. Suddenly, the internet wasn't just a tool for scientists or universities. It was becoming a household utility. The arrival of ISPs opened the floodgates. Millions of new users came online. People browsed websites, sent emails, and explored online communities. Entire industries began to form around web development, hosting services, and digital advertising. Newspapers launched online editions. Retailers experimented with e-commerce. Musicians shared early digital audio files. Hobbyists created pages about their interests. The web was becoming a mirror of human curiosity, creativity, and connection. At the same time, the earliest search tools emerged. Archie and Gopher had offered early ways to find files, but the web's explosive growth demanded something more powerful. Early search engines like Lycos, Webcrawler, and Alta Vista appeared, helping users navigate the expanding universe of pages. They indexed content, sorted results, and tried to interpret what people were looking for. Although primitive by modern standards, they were essential tools in making the web usable. The web also gave rise to new forms of communication. Online forums expanded. Email lists grew. Early forms of instant messaging appeared. People discovered online identities, friendships, debates, and communities. What had once been a cold, technical network was evolving into a social and cultural environment where people gathered, shared, and expressed themselves. As the web matured through the mid-1990s, it began reshaping societies and economies. Businesses realized that a website was not just optional, it was essential. Governments used the web to communicate with citizens. Schools used it for education. News outlets updated stories in real time. The world was beginning to shift faster than anyone expected. But despite all this progress, the web was still in its infancy. It lacked sophisticated multimedia tools. Pages were mostly static. Video streaming was still years away. Mobile devices had not yet entered the picture. Social networks did not exist. Search engines were limited. E-commerce was clumsy. Yet even with all these limitations, it was obvious that the web was something extraordinary. Tim Berners-Lee's vision had taken root, but he did not claim ownership of it. In a remarkable act that shaped the future of technology, CERN announced in 1993 that the World Wide Web would be available to the public for free. No licensing fees, no proprietary restrictions, no hidden barriers. This decision ensured that the web would remain open, decentralized, and innovative. It allowed millions of developers around the world to experiment freely, creating new tools and sites without needing permission. The spirit of openness that guided the web's creation helped ensure its explosive and democratic growth. Without it, the web might have become controlled by a small group of corporations or governments. Instead, it became a playground for innovation available to anyone with curiosity and a computer. By the end of the 1990s, the World Wide Web had become the fastest-growing information system in human history. It transformed communication, reshaped business, expanded access to knowledge, and altered the way people lived their daily lives. Yet even as the world celebrated its possibilities, it was clear that the web was only the beginning. The decades ahead would bring unimaginable expansion. Social media, streaming, smartphones, cloud computing, artificial intelligence, and countless other innovations. But all of it, every message, every website, every video, every search, traced back to a single idea from a researcher at CERN trying to organize his laboratory's documents. It was the moment the internet gained a human-friendly face. The moment connectivity met creativity. The moment information became truly accessible. The dawn of the World Wide Web had arrived, and with it, the world entered a new era. By the mid-1990s, the internet was no longer a quiet research network tucked away in universities and government laboratories. It had entered the public imagination. The web had made it visible, accessible, and exciting in a way that previous networking technologies never could. But for the internet to truly become a global necessity, it needed to expand beyond academic circles and early adopters. It needed to move into homes, businesses, libraries, schools, and eventually into pockets and hands. This chapter marks the period when the internet transitioned from a niche tool to a mainstream phenomenon, an irreversible shift in human history. In the early 1990s, connecting to the internet was still a complicated and sometimes frustrating process. People needed a dial-up modem, subscription to an internet service provider, and a good deal of patience. The modem emitted a series of screeches, beeps, and digital tones that became iconic. Once connected, speeds were slow, sometimes painfully so, and the slightest interruption, like someone picking up the telephone, could break the connection instantly. Yet millions embraced the experience because it offered something unprecedented: access to a vast digital world. One of the earliest forces pushing the internet into the public sphere was commercial adoption. As soon as the National Science Foundation lifted restrictions on commercial traffic in the early 1990s, businesses rushed to establish an online presence. At first, companies simply created informational websites, digital brochures with basic details about products and services. But soon, the potential for e-commerce began to emerge. Visionaries imagined a future where people could buy books, music, electronics, and even groceries online. This vision led to the birth of some of the earliest internet giants. In 1994, Jeff Bezos founded Amazon, initially an online bookstore. In 1995, eBay emerged as an online auction platform where individuals could buy and sell items directly to each other. These early pioneers showed that the internet wasn't just a communication tool, it was a marketplace. It could connect buyers and sellers around the world. It could build trust in digital transactions. It could become a platform for entrepreneurs. The commercial internet exploded as companies both large and small rushed to join the digital gold rush. At the same time, software companies recognized the importance of empowering ordinary people to navigate the web. Browsers became the gateway to the internet, and competition heated up quickly. Netscape Navigator dominated the early browser market, becoming synonymous with the web itself. In 1995, Microsoft entered the arena with Internet Explorer, launching the so-called browser wars. This competition accelerated innovation. Browsers became faster, more stable, and more capable. They added support for images, animations, scripting, plugins, and multimedia. The web evolved from static documents into interactive environments. Governments and public institutions also began encouraging internet adoption. Libraries offered public access terminals. Schools added computer labs and taught basic digital literacy. Governments set up websites to share information and allow citizens to submit forms online. The internet became a place not just for entertainment and business, but for civic engagement. As the public embraced the internet, the culture surrounding it evolved rapidly. Online communities formed through forums, chat rooms, and early messaging services. These communities allowed people to connect over shared interests: music, technology, hobbies, games, politics, and more. People discovered that the internet wasn't just a source of information. It was a place to meet others, exchange ideas, and form relationships. Friendships and romances bloomed online long before social media existed. One of the earliest cultural icons of the public internet era was America Online, or AOL. With its user-friendly interface, instant messaging, chat rooms, and customizable profiles, AOL brought millions of everyday users online. Its "You've got mail" greeting became a symbol of the digital age. For many people, AOL was the internet. It offered both connectivity and community, wrapped in a friendly environment that welcomed newcomers who didn't understand the complexities of networking technology. AOL also introduced the idea of an online identity: usernames, avatars, and personal spaces where people could express themselves. This concept would later become fundamental to the rise of social networks. Meanwhile, the broader web continued to expand at an astonishing rate. As more people came online, more websites appeared, creating an ever-growing ecosystem of information and entertainment. Early personal websites flourished, often hosted on services like GeoCities, AngelFire, or Tripod. These sites were brightly colored, animated, sometimes chaotic, digital scrapbooks that reflected the individuality and creativity of their creators. In many ways, they represented the internet's original spirit of openness and personal expression. Search engines played a crucial role in making this expanding universe navigable. Early engines like Yahoo, Lycos, and AltaVista helped users find websites, but their methods were limited. Pages had to be manually indexed or sorted based on rudimentary algorithms. In 1998, two Stanford students, Larry Page and Sergey Brin, introduced a new approach. Their search engine, Google, ranked pages based on their relationships to other pages, how many sites linked to them, and the significance of those links. This innovation made search more relevant, accurate, and powerful. Google quickly rose to dominate the search landscape, becoming the gateway to the web for millions of users. The late 1990s saw enormous momentum. Technology companies flourished. Venture capital poured into internet startups. The term .com became synonymous with innovation, opportunity, and wealth. Startups promised to revolutionize every industry: food delivery, entertainment, banking, retail, and even pets. Investors placed huge bets on unproven ideas, convinced that anything related to the internet was destined for success. This period, known as the .com boom, brought both excitement and excess. Some companies developed viable, forward-thinking business models. Others burned through vast amounts of money without producing anything sustainable. By 2000, the bubble burst. Stock markets plummeted. Thousands of companies failed. Many believed the internet revolution had ended before it truly began. But while the crash devastated markets, it did not stop the internet's growth. In many ways, the collapse of the .com bubble cleared the way for a more stable and mature digital economy. The companies that survived, like Amazon, eBay, Google, and others, emerged stronger. They learned from the mistakes of the era and began building robust infrastructures, scalable technologies, and long-term strategies. The internet was no longer a speculative dream. It was becoming an essential platform for business, communication, and everyday life. As broadband connections began replacing dial-up in the early 2000s, the internet's capabilities expanded dramatically. Higher speeds allowed for richer websites, streaming media, video calls, and immersive online experiences. Broadband removed the limitations of dial-up, making the internet more reliable and always available. This shift set the stage for the next generation of innovation, including social networks, online video platforms, web applications, and eventually cloud computing. But even before those transformations arrived, the public internet had already achieved something remarkable. It had woven itself into everyday routines. People used it to check email, browse news, connect with friends, and search for information. Businesses relied on it for communication and commerce. Students used it for research and learning. Governments used it to share information and improve services. The internet was no longer an experiment or a luxury. It was becoming a fundamental part of modern society. The expansion of public access also revealed deeper societal impacts. The internet democratized information, allowing anyone with a connection to learn, create, and share. But it also introduced concerns: privacy, security, misinformation, digital divides, and cultural shifts that would eventually spark debates about technology's role in human life. These concerns would grow in importance as the internet became more powerful. But in the 1990s, the focus remained largely on the opportunities. The transition from a niche academic network to a global public resource was one of the most profound shifts in the history of communication. For the first time, billions of people had access to a shared digital space that connected them across geography, culture, and language. The internet had broken free from its origins. It was becoming something larger than any institution, company, or government. It was becoming a universal platform for human interaction. By the end of the 1990s, the internet had entered mainstream life. The seeds of the modern digital world had been planted. But the next stage, the rise of social platforms, streaming media, smartphones, and global connectivity, would push the internet even deeper into daily experience. The world was about to enter a new era, one where the internet would not just accompany human life, but integrate into every part of it. By the early 2000s, the internet had already reshaped how people communicated, worked, and searched for information. But something even more transformative was beginning to take shape, an evolution not of hardware or infrastructure, but of human interaction itself. As broadband connections became widespread and web technologies matured, the internet shifted from a tool for accessing information to a platform for connecting people in entirely new ways. The seeds of this transformation were planted in the late 1990s. Early social spaces like chat rooms, bulletin boards, and instant messaging had introduced the idea that the internet could host communities and relationships. But these early systems were fragmented. Users had multiple identities across different services, and the tools for expressing oneself online were rudimentary. What was missing was a sense of persistent identity, a single place where an individual could present themselves to the digital world. In this environment, a new generation of social platforms began to emerge. One of the earliest pioneers was Friendster, launched in 2002. While it struggled with technical issues, it introduced key ideas, profile pages, friend networks, and activity feeds that showed what others were doing. For the first time, users could map their real-world social circles into digital space. This idea quickly gained traction. In 2003, MySpace took the concept further. Unlike Friendster, MySpace allowed, and even encouraged, extensive customization. Backgrounds, music, animated graphics, and personal layouts made every page a canvas. It became a hub for emerging musicians, artists, and teens who wanted a place to express themselves. For a brief period, MySpace was the center of online culture, shaping trends, launching careers, and creating a digital lifestyle that felt raw, creative, and uniquely early internet. But a quieter, more structured platform was forming in the background. In 2004, a Harvard student named Mark Zuckerberg launched Facebook as a campus-exclusive network. Its clean design contrasted sharply with the chaotic freedom of MySpace. Facebook focused on real identities and authentic connections. Users interacted through status updates, photos, and groups. Over time, Facebook expanded beyond universities, eventually opening to the public and becoming the dominant social network. The shift from customization to consistency reflected a deeper cultural transition, from personal expression to shared social experience. Meanwhile, other forms of online interaction were flourishing. Blogging platforms like LiveJournal, Blogger, and later WordPress empowered individuals to share long-form thoughts with global audiences. Blogging blurred the line between private journals and public publishing, creating early influencers and citizen journalists. The internet was no longer just a place to consume media, it was a place to create it. Video also found its home online. In 2005, YouTube emerged with a simple but revolutionary premise. Anyone could upload a video, share it, and build an audience. The barriers to creation collapsed. People shared home videos, tutorials, jokes, personal stories, and creative experiments. Viral videos became part of everyday conversation. YouTube democratized broadcasting in a way television never could. At the same time, the infrastructure of connection was becoming more seamless. Messaging and voice services like Skype enabled global communication at virtually no cost. People could see and hear loved ones across oceans with a single click, something unimaginable just a decade earlier. These shifts weren't purely technological, they were cultural. The internet was turning into a reflection of human social life. It captured friendships, emotions, celebrations, and conflicts. It amplified voices that had been marginalized, allowed communities to form around shared identities, and gave people the freedom to explore new aspects of themselves. But this new era brought challenges. Privacy became more complex as people shared more of their lives online. Digital footprints accumulated, often without users fully understanding their permanence. The lines between public and private blurred. Online interactions sometimes caused misunderstandings or conflicts that spilled into offline life. The internet had become a mirror, not always flattering, of society. Still, the momentum was unstoppable. Social connectivity was no longer a novelty. It was becoming a defining feature of the digital landscape. People didn't just use the internet, they lived part of their lives there, and a new device was about to change everything again. The next transformation wouldn't come from a website or a software platform, but from something people could hold in their hands. It would bring the internet from desks and laps directly into pockets, blurring the boundary between online and offline life forever. The age of mobility was approaching, and the world was about to become connected in a way that felt almost effortless. As the first decade of the 21st century progressed, the internet had woven itself deeply into homes, workplaces, and social spaces. But one crucial barrier remained: mobility. Most online activity still depended on desktop computers or, at best, bulky laptops tethered to Wi-Fi networks. The internet was powerful, but it was not yet constant. It lived in places rather than with people. That changed when mobile technology collided with the digital world. Before smartphones, mobile phones were limited tools, useful for calling, texting, and playing simple games. Some early models added crude web browsers, but the experience was painfully slow and awkward. Tiny screens, limited bandwidth, and restrictive interfaces made the mobile internet feel like a poor imitation of the real thing. People used it only when absolutely necessary. But engineers and designers across the tech world were searching for a breakthrough. Portable computing had been a dream since the earliest days of personal computers, with devices like PDA's personal digital assistants offering glimpses of a connected future. Yet none had managed to combine power, usability, and true internet access in a way appealing to everyday users. The turning point arrived in 2007. When Apple introduced the iPhone, it reimagined what a phone could be. Instead of buttons, there was a smooth touchscreen. Instead of clunky menus, there was a full-featured web browser. Instead of isolated apps, there was a single device capable of accessing the entire internet with intuitive gestures. It wasn't the first smartphone, but it was the first to make mobile internet feel natural, fluid, and inviting. The timing couldn't have been better. Wireless networks had improved, data plans were becoming more accessible, and Wi-Fi hotspots were spreading. Suddenly, people didn't have to wait until they got home to check email or sit down at a computer to browse the web. The internet traveled with them, on buses, in cafes, at parks, in waiting rooms, and eventually everywhere. Just 1 year later, the introduction of the App Store transformed everything again. Instead of accessing the web through a browser alone, users could download dedicated applications tailored for specific tasks. Games, navigation tools, social networks, productivity apps, and countless other creations. Developers around the world seized the opportunity, building programs that reimagined what mobile devices could do. The phone became a pocket-sized platform for creativity, communication, and entertainment. Competition quickly intensified. Google's Android operating system brought smartphone capabilities to a wider range of devices and price points. Manufacturers across the world began producing phones that offered features once reserved for high-end models. This widespread adoption accelerated the mobile revolution, making internet access increasingly universal. The cultural impact was profound. With mobile connectivity, the internet became integrated into daily life in ways that previous generations could hardly imagine. People no longer had to plan when and where to go online. Instead, they lived in a state of perpetual connection. They checked social media updates while walking down the street, shared photos instantly, streamed music on commutes, and navigated unfamiliar places using digital maps. This new mobility also transformed industries. Banking apps replaced visits to local branches. Ride-sharing platforms reinvented transportation. Streaming services disrupted television and radio. Mobile gaming became a global phenomenon, turning simple puzzle games and immersive experiences alike into cultural staples. Retail shifted as well. Online shopping moved from desktops to pockets, enabling consumers to browse and purchase products anytime. Social networks, too, became inseparable from mobile devices. Platforms like Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram optimized their interfaces for phones, turning every spare moment into an opportunity to interact, share, and scroll. Mobile cameras turned everyone into a photographer, documenting moments that once went unrecorded. The idea of being online evolved into something different, always being connected to a digital layer overlaying the physical world. But with this transformation came new challenges. Notifications demanded constant attention. The boundary between work and personal life blurred. People found themselves competing for digital visibility, measuring popularity through likes and followers. Privacy concerns intensified as devices collected unprecedented amounts of personal data. Location tracking, targeted advertising, and algorithmic feeds reshaped behavior in subtle but powerful ways. Despite these issues, the mobile internet undeniably expanded access. For many people around the world, smartphones became the primary, sometimes the only, tool for going online. Mobile networks brought connectivity to regions that had never been fully wired for broadband. Entire countries experienced their first wave of digital participation through phones rather than computers. By the early 2010s, the world had adapted to a new rhythm. The internet was no longer a destination, it was a companion, a constant presence, something people touched every few minutes without thinking. The shift from stationary to mobile computing was not just a technical milestone, it was a cultural one. It changed how people interacted with information, with each other, and with the world. And even as mobile devices took center stage, another revolution was quietly unfolding, one that would turn the internet from a collection of websites and apps into the invisible backbone of global technology. The future was moving toward cloud computing, artificial intelligence, and an increasingly interconnected world. The digital era was entering its next frontier. By the mid-2010s, the internet had completed one of the most dramatic transformations in human history. What began as a research experiment in the 1960s had grown into the central nervous system of modern civilization. Mobile phones, cloud computing, artificial intelligence, streaming platforms, and social networks all converged to create an always-on, always-connected world. The digital era was no longer emerging. It was here, woven into the fabric of everyday life. The rise of cloud computing redefined how information was stored and accessed. Instead of relying on a single device, people could now keep their data, photos, communications, and work in remote servers accessible from anywhere. This shift brought unprecedented flexibility. Files followed users across continents. Collaborative documents allowed teams to work together in real time. Applications ran remotely, powering everything from business operations to personal entertainment. Artificial intelligence also began to reshape the digital landscape. Early AI systems powered recommendation engines, predicting what users might want to watch, buy, or read. Virtual assistants like Siri, Alexa, and Google Assistant introduced conversational computing, letting people interact with machines naturally through speech. Behind the scenes, algorithms filtered content, detected patterns, translated languages, and made sense of vast amounts of data. While sometimes invisible to users, AI had become a cornerstone of the modern internet. Alongside these technological leaps, new forms of digital expression blossomed. Social media matured into a global communication platform, giving rise to influencers, online activism, viral movements, and digital communities that transcended borders. Platforms like Instagram, TikTok, and Twitter amplified individual voices in ways previously impossible, allowing ordinary people to reach millions with a single post. At the same time, the world's entertainment habits shifted dramatically. Streaming services replaced traditional television. YouTube evolved into a universal stage for creators and educators. Music moved entirely online. Video games became massive social hubs, complete with live streaming, esports, and virtual communities that rivaled real-world gatherings. The internet was no longer just a window to the world, it was a world. Global communication changed as well. Video chatting became effortless. International collaboration became commonplace. Long-distance relationships of all kinds, friendships, families, businesses, strengthened through instant connectivity. The barriers of geography faded as digital presence became as meaningful as physical presence. Yet, with these opportunities came profound concerns. The same technologies that connected people also introduced new challenges. Misinformation that spread rapidly, privacy issues that were difficult to navigate, and social pressures amplified by online visibility. Cybersecurity became a critical global issue as criminals targeted digital systems. Governments debated how to regulate platforms that wielded enormous influence. Digital literacy became essential, not just knowing how to use technology, but understanding how it shaped thoughts, behaviors, and society. Despite these challenges, the internet continued to evolve. Smart devices filled homes, cars, and cities. EOT sensors monitored everything from thermostats to traffic lights. Remote work became mainstream. Digital payments and cryptocurrencies reimagined finance. The boundaries between physical and digital life grew increasingly porous. By the late 2010s and into the 2020s, a new generation had grown up native to the digital environment. To them, the internet wasn't a marvel or a novelty. It was simply a reality. A place to learn, create, socialize, explore, and build futures. Many of the technologies once considered revolutionary, touchscreens, cloud apps, video calls, streaming platforms, had become mundane parts of daily routines. Looking back, the journey from a niche academic network to a universal global platform feels both fast and inevitable. At each step, public access, social networking, mobile connectivity, cloud computing, AI, the internet expanded not just in capability, but in meaning. It became a mirror of humanity, our creativity, our curiosity, our conflicts, and our connections. The story of the internet is ultimately a story about people. It's about the instinct to communicate, to innovate, to explore new frontiers. It's about the desire to share knowledge and build communities. And it's about the ways technology reshapes us, even as we reshape it. Today, the internet continues to evolve, pushing into new territories: virtual worlds, augmented reality, advanced AI, decentralized networks, quantum computing. No one knows exactly what the next chapters will hold. But one thing is certain: the digital age is far from over. It's still being written every day by billions of people around the world who log on, create, share, learn, and connect. And with that, this story of how the internet became our global companion comes to a close. But the real story, the one unfolding right now, is yours to take part in. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share it to support the work. Your engagement helps bring more content like this to life. Thank you for being here, and welcome to the journey.